Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and in today's final Sharks year in review, we will be reviewing the performance of number 88, Brent Burns. Now, Brent Burns actually had a career year for himself as he played very, very well offensively throughout the majority of this season. His defensive game, however, was more or less okay, and it's hard to put so much blame onto Brent Burns for that, as he did have to deal with a rotating cast of defensemen on his pair. For at the start of the season, it was expected that Joachim Ryan would fill in onto that top pairing with Brent Burns, as he had performed quite admirably in that role in the previous year. But Joachim Ryan ended up being quite bad throughout the majority of the season, so the Sharks had to look elsewhere, and they ended up finding that in what was their eighth defenseman, Radim Shemek. And while Shemek was quite good in his role as Brent Burns' defensive partner for about half the season, he ended up getting injured, where Joachim Ryan had to step back in. And it's certainly no coincidence that Brent Burns' worst times defensively this season came at the start and at the end of it, both times with Joachim Ryan as his defensive partner. In the playoffs, however, when De Boer decided to drop down to 5 defensemen, Brent Burns found himself frequently with Marc-Edouard Vlasic on the top pairing, where Brent Burns performed very, very well defensively and offensively, actually played a very well-rounded game, and Vlasic himself also stepped up defensively compared to how he performed during the regular season. So in the regular season, Brent Burns played all 82 games, 16 goals and 67 assists for 83 points, so just barely over that point per game mark. Actually, the first defenseman in a long time to make it there. Erik Karlsson himself had 82 games played, 82 points a few years back, but that's technically only a point per game and not over a point per game, so Brent Burns has that record at the moment in the last couple of decades. He was also a very impressive plus 13, and to put this plus 13 into context, you do have to consider the fact that Brent Burns is basically always on when the Sharks are trying to tie up a game with an empty net. And empty nets technically count as even strength. So you're going to accumulate big negative numbers just from that. Let's say the Sharks had their goalie pulled 20 times during this season. They've probably only tied up the game in that situation, a couple of times, and yet probably gave up empty net goals a good half of those times. And so already he would be at let's say a -8. So for a lot of people who were saying Brent Burns wasn't that great defensively this season, well, he did still manage to be on the ice for a lot more goals for than goals against. So an impressive plus 13 for Brent Burns. Also, 28 power play points, which is a massive amount. Doesn't take away too much from his even strength points, which were still a very impressive 55. Most defensemen in the league don't even reach 55 points in general. The fact that Brent Burns gets 55 even strength points is extremely impressive. And his time on ice was 25 minutes and 6 seconds, just about 30 seconds over the second place player on the team, which was Erik Karlsson. In the playoffs, Brent Burns again played every single game, so all 102 games played by Brent Burns this season, 5 goals and 11 assists for 16 points. A small asterisk next to that 16 points, however, he did get 10 of those throughout the entirety of the Colorado Avalanche series, with most of them coming in just a couple of games. And so in the Golden Knights and the Blues series, Brent Burns only had 6 points in those 13 games, so somewhat disappointing there, but still 16 points in 20 games, certainly nothing to scoff at. Pretty solid plus 2. His defensive partner Vlasic was a bit higher than that, but of course Brent Burns again with the whole empty net thing. When the Sharks need to tie the game, you would see likely Brent Burns with Erik Karlsson, so it's hard to put too much blame on Brent Burns. 5 power play points, which all things considered is pretty decent in the playoffs here, as well as a massive over 28 minutes, close to 28 and a half minutes. This is just less than 4 minutes more than the next closest player on the Sharks, which was again Erik Karlsson. So it just goes to show how much was really put on Brent Burns' shoulders. He was second in power play ice time behind Erik Karlsson, but he was near the tops in terms of shorthanded ice time, and he was heavily at the top in terms of even strength ice time as well. There was actually only a single defenseman who was above Brent Burns in terms of playoff ice time on any team, and that was Seth Jones, who had just about 7 seconds more per game. And of course, Brent Burns playing the 20 games compared to Seth Jones's 10, it is a lot more difficult to go, the long distance, the whole 9 yards, compared to Seth Jones, who only played a couple of rounds. So very impressive that Brent Burns was able to take on this much responsibility. And recall, not only was it offensive responsibility, which Brent Burns always has, but because of the fact he was paired with Vlasic for the majority of his time, he also took on a ton of defensive responsibility. With Erik Karlsson injured, Brent Burns and Vlasic was their shutdown pairing, so those were certainly not an easy 28.5 minutes. For his grades on the year, the first quarter he got an A-, the second quarter a B+, the third quarter was very strong with the grade of an A, and the fourth quarter struggled a bit down the stretch with a grade of a B. In the playoffs, because of his offensive game was somewhat inconsistent, I ended up giving him the grade of a B+, but as a final grade on the year, I will end up giving him an A-. He was the defenseman who was runner-up for the Norris, only behind Mark Giordano, who actually also had a career year in the twilight of his career at age 35 or so that was also quite impressive. Probably the only reason why Brent Burns didn't get his second Norris in just 3 years. Still, an extremely impressive season for Brent Burns, and hopefully if he can find some more stability with his defensive partner going into the next season, he can replicate this type of performance. Class dismissed.